Welcome to Lab 4, Earth's Energy Budget. So again, this video has been provided for you to have some assistance as you work through this lab on your own, or maybe you need it as reference when reviewing for later in the term. But it's really designed as a page-by-page way for us to evaluate the content within these labs. Now we can see within the learning objectives of this lab that we'll learn to define the electromagnetic radiation and describe the electromagnetic spectrum. We'll also analyze radiation data, explain the Earth's energy budget, differentiate among radiation, absorption, reflection, scattering, refraction, and even transmission. We'll also interpret radiation data collected through remote sensing techniques. So that being said, let's start the lab. So let's move on to part A, electromagnetic radiation. Now, before we investigate Earth's energy budget, let's think about radiation, energy transmitted through space. Have you ever wondered how Wi-Fi, microwaves, or radios work? Well, each of these devices make use of electromagnetic waves. So what we can see in the diagram below, figure 4.1, is we can see a wave. We can observe the peak, the trough, the wavelength, and the amplitude. And we'll talk a little bit more about why those words are important to understand. So as we can observe on the next page, it says refer, question 1, to figure 4.2. Which electromagnetic wave example represents shorter wavelength? Well, I have something that you may not have, which is a classic slinky. Same idea. So when I move it up and down, I can see both my crests and the troughs. So is this an example of short or long wavelength? And what about this? Is this short or long wavelength? And I think they just kind of that visualization of it moving, these two, is one short and which one is long, for you to understand really the differences between them. You can also observe that action that I just did down below when looking at the electromagnetic spectrum, which answers part of question 2. Question 2 has you observe the electromagnetic spectrum and to distinguish the different variations of types of radiation that we are accustomed and observed every day in our lives. We also learn a little bit later about long wave and short wave and what that really means. That the sun itself emits short wave, other wavelengths as well, but for energy-wise for us is short wave, and the Earth absorbs that and reflects long wave radiation, which can also be known as sensible heat. But we'll talk more about that later. So these diagrams will help you solve these problems. Moving forward, we can move into part B, known as net radiation. Net radiation is the balance between incoming and outgoing energy at the top of the atmosphere. Some of the sunlight that reaches the Earth is reflected back to space by bright surfaces such as clouds, even ice. Water also is able to absorb but reflect some as well. A word that becomes very important here is albedo. Albedo is the level of whiteness a surface will be. The whiter the surface, the more reflective the surface. The darker the surface, the more absorbed it will be within that energy that is received. So most simply, the net radiation equation is as follows. Net radiation is equal to incoming minus outgoing radiation. So you'll continue to read through this lab, which provides you additional context, which brings us into table 4.1, monthly and annual average insolation. Insolation is otherwise known as incoming solar radiation. In this particular place, they're picking 3 locations, looking at Alaska, China, and Uganda. So plot the monthly average data presented in table 4.1 on the blank graph below. Use a different colored pencil or pen for each location. As an example, blue for Dead Horse, green for Beijing, and red for Kampala. And connect the points with a line. And what we're going to be able to observe is how the amount of radiation changes throughout the course of the year, because perhaps you've noticed that within this table we have our main months, of which we see our solstices and equinoxes, and then we have our annual totals of radiation that is absorbed. So you'll plot that on this graph here. Moving down here, we will then answer questions based off of your findings, based off of your drawings. So make sure that you do those in different colors. It makes it easier for us to be able to grade it, but also allows you to really see the differences and how different locations or latitudes will receive different amounts or varying amounts of radiation throughout the course of a year. So you'll see there's a lot of relationships between what we're observing in Lab 4 as to what we learned earlier in Lab 3. So in the next radiation equation, outgoing radiation includes reflected or shortwave radiation and what's considered terrestrial radiation. So you'll continue to learn a little bit about that as we move on to this table. 4.2, the monthly average radiation for Dead Horse, Alaska. So we're able to look at the incoming, outgoing, shortwave, outgoing, long wave, and then our net radiation. So in order to calculate the total net radiation for Dead Horse in March, subtract outgoing long wave radiation and outgoing shortwave radiation from the incoming total radiation. So you're going to end up filling in these final 3 boxes, and then based on those values, those observations will be interpreted to answer the remaining questions. Moving forward, we look at an itemized list again for Beijing, an itemized one for Uganda, so you'll go ahead and complete those as well. Moving forward, we have another activity. Let's explore net radiation on an animated world map provided by NASA's Earth Observatory. So the first step is to take a photo of this QR code or to click on the hyperlink and follow the steps 2 and 3 to be able to answer some questions. And that being said, that will wrap up then part B. So moving on to part C, Earth's energy budget. Solar radiation reaches the surface of the Earth in the form of shortwave radiation and is considered incoming radiation. Radiation or energy that leaves the Earth in the form of long-wave radiation is considered outgoing radiation. In this lab, we've observed both of those within their retrospect, but looking here, we look a little bit more specifically at emission, absorption, and reflection. Remember, I mentioned the word albedo. Albedo is the level of whiteness a surface has. So the whiter of a surface you have, the more radiation will be reflected, solar radiation, from that surface. So think about, like, if you've ever been skiing or snowboarding. If you don't wear the special goggles, you'll go snowblind because the sun is literally reflecting off of that snow and shining right into your eyes. Or thinking about perhaps a vehicle, a black car versus a white car, out and parked in the parking lot during the heat of summer. Which car will be hotter on the inside? And so you'll learn a little bit more about that on these pages. Moving forward, we can see some additional phrasing such as scattering, refraction, and transmission, which brings us to this wonderful diagram, figure 4.5. This is the Earth's energy budget. Yellow numbers account for incoming shortwave radiation, and red numbers account for outgoing long-wave radiation. So this is based on an observation of just 100%. So assuming that the Earth receives, whatever it receives, that amount is 100%, where does it go? And as we can see here, about 51% of it is absorbed along the Earth's surface. And then we can see that other things do happen with that energy, and it kind of transfers a little bit here and there. So make sure you clearly understand and observe and interpret those numbers and values and why it works in that manner. Moving to the next page, we're going to have a set of questions that go back to that diagram and ask you to really interpret those numbers and values and how that works. Again, I think the easiest way to understand this is to just relate it to your personal life. Think about surfaces that reflect, surfaces that absorb, surfaces that you would rather walk on during the summer barefoot, blacktop, or perhaps a lighter colored concrete, and think about that type of radiation. Another thing that I want to throw in there that I think is very interesting is that light, the visible light that we see when you stick your hands up, in the summer. The light is not what's hot. Your skin absorbs some of that radiation and emits long wave. That's what we call sensible heat. So that heat coming off of your hand is what warms your hand. Think about when you're driving on the freeway and you can see, that oasis type, element where you can see the waves actually emitting from the asphalt as you're driving out in the desert. That is visually, perceiving that long wave radiation. And that wraps up part C. So let's move on to part D. Now, part D is called Remote Sensing and Earth's Energy Budget. So let's go behind the scenes to learn how scientists calculate Earth's energy budget. Part of the research comes from data collected by remote sensing. The term remote sensing is commonly used to describe the science and art of identifying, observing, and measuring an object without coming into direct contact with it at all. So we'll be able to learn a little bit about active sensors, passive sensors, and things like that. As we work through this page, we get a beautiful diagram, figure 4.6, showing different types of remote sensing platforms. Questions 16 and 17 it's asking you to use your critical thinking skills in that diagram above and thinking about what types of applications or things in which that data can be sensed or used. Then you'll move forward and looking at one of NASA's remote sensing instruments used to understand Earth's radiation and learn a little bit more about that. As you work through this portion, you will see here that it explains a little bit more about what to expect. Moving to the last page, page 13, we get some beautiful imagery showing. This one in particular is showing changes to Earth's albedo between March 1st and December 31st in between 2000 and 2011. So we're looking at the albedo changes, which I'm not going to give too much away, but think about what surfaces would be considered high in albedo. And so question 18 is asking you to reflect on this imagery. What is this imagery telling you? What changes have we observed and been able to interpret from these, this imagery between those two dates, about 11 years apart? Then you move on to page 14, which looks at some different types of, this is ship trackings in North American Atlantic. So we're looking at some different imagery, in particular looking at anthropogenic and aerosols, types of human-caused effects of cloud cover. Again, working through this data, working through this imagery, and it's just really, it's trying to have you look at the science visually, looking at it a little bit differently than just a graph or a table. Is like, well, what are we actually observing from a photo perspective? And that's what this is taking us through, which brings us to our last page, which is having you apply what you learned and in your own words explain how aerosols and ship tracks create local cooling effects and blah blah blah. You'll work through those elements. Question 20, 21, again using those critical thinking skills, using the imagery and things found within remote sensing, and to try to apply the physical hard science numbers to things that we have observed in our landscape. So this was a shorter lab, so I hope that you had some fun with it. Again, if you have any questions, be sure to comment below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and we'll talk soon on another lab.